It is Bronze and Modern Gods. I'm John.
And I'm Richard.
A little different show this week. As you know, sometimes we like to mix it up a bit and do an interview with a comics professional. This week, we're super excited. Richard, are you excited?
Yes, I'm very excited. This week, we have probably one of John's favorite writers of all time, Mark Evanier.
Yeah, you know him from his runs on Blackhawk, Groo the Wanderer, Crossfire, D and Agents, so many, many more that we'll get into here. I don't want to waste any time except to remind you to like, subscribe. I want to give a special thank you and shout out to our good friend Gary Sassaman from his YouTube channel, Tales from My Spinner Rack. Gary helped hook us up with Mark, and we truly appreciate it. Go check out Gary's channel forthwith. All right, Richard, Lois not whatnot. Let's go right to the interview. What do you say?
All right, let's go.
Roll that beautiful bean footage. Today's guest has a career that spans nearly every corner of the comics world. From his time assisting Jack Kirby on the New Gods and Mr. Miracle, his work on so many Western publishing comics, to his acclaimed runs on Blackhawk and Crossfire, and of course, his decades-long partnership with Sergio Aragonés on Groo the Wanderer. And now Mark has turned his encyclopedic knowledge and deep love for the medium towards one of the most beloved creations in comics, Peanuts. He's the author of the new book, The Essential Peanuts by Charles Schulz, the greatest comic strip of all time, which celebrates 75 years of Charlie Brown, Snoopy, and the whole Peanuts gang. It's part history, part tribute, and a beautiful book, and a look at how the Peanuts became one of the most influential and emotionally resonant comic strips ever created. Mark's one of those rare voices who connects the silver, the bronze, the copper age, and the modern comics landscape. We are super thrilled to welcome one of the most respected writers, editors, and historians in comics, Mr. Mark Evanier. Here he is.
Wow. Gee, that's an introduction. I can't possibly live up to, that sounds like an introduction for a guy who can't hold a job for very long. All those different things. Before we go any further, yes, it's a beautiful book, and I have two words to say: Chip Kidd.
Mm-hmm.
That's why it's a beautiful book. Chip did an amazing job designing that book, and I'll take any bows for it, even as long as people understand I didn't do a damn thing in that department.
I made the biggest mistake with your book. I bought it on Kindle first.
This is not a Kindle book. This is.
Tell everyone why it's not a Kindle book.
Because it's got so damn many pictures in it, and it's got a bonus section with your very own Peanuts comic book and your very own Snoopy landing on the moon patch and a bunch of postcards and posters and all sorts of neat things.
This is a tactile experience, and it's now, as we found out this week from Mark's blog, newsfromme.com, it's available at Costco.
That's right, yes, but you have to buy a rotisserie chicken and six rolls of toilet paper at the same time, and a set of snow tires.
Yes, exactly. And I think you could buy the book in bulk at Costco too.
Yeah, they have the 24 pack, which is very handy. I was going to give them out for trick or treaters last night, but the book's too expensive for that.
What drew you to write this Peanuts 75th anniversary book, and how do you even begin to capture something that monumental?
Well, I had the perfect reason to write it. Someone offered me money to do it.
Perfect.
They just came to me and they said, we need someone there should be a 75th anniversary Peanuts book. And I think they'd gone through some other people before they, lowered their standards down to me. And I thought about it for a long time. I thought about it for half a second. And I thought, gee, I get to immerse myself in this strip for weeks or months, whatever it takes to do the book. I have an excuse to sit here in my computer and read every Peanut strip ever done in chronological order and feel like I'm not wasting my time. I'm being paid for it. And so I didn't ask what the deadline was. I didn't ask what the fee was. I didn't ask anything other than when do you want me to start? And it turned out we didn't have as much time as I would have liked, because you had to get a book out to coincide with the 75th anniversary. We couldn't have this book come out in 6 months. And we got it out on time, and I'm very happy with it. And an awful lot of other people deserve credit for it being so wonderful. Chief among them, the people who worked in the organization Mr. Schulz set up to supervise Peanuts, including his widow, Jean. He didn't set that up. She just runs that naturally. And also the people at the Charles M. Schulz Museum and Research Center in Santa Rosa, California, which is a fabulous place you should visit if you have the slightest interest in Peanuts. In fact, you have to visit this, and you will walk out just more impressed with what Mr. Schulz did than you were when you went in, no matter how impressed you were when you went in.
So did you get to handle original art from that collection?
I didn't. I was at the museum before I was hired to write this book, and everything was under glass. I do happen to have an original Charles Schulz on my wall downstairs, a Sunday page, and I think that's the only piece of his artwork I've ever handled. He gave it to me and signed it to me, and I took it happily home and had it framed.
Was that the one time he went to Comic-Con?
No. This was years later when I visited him in his studio. He was at Comic-Con once in 1974. He was invited a couple other years, and once, I think at least 2 or 3 times he accepted, and then other problems, health and work, I assume, interrupted. So he was only at Comic-Con in San Diego once. But I got to meet him there and spend some time with him. And then later on, I had a number of occasions to meet him at different events. One at an NCS meeting, a couple on projects I worked for a number of years for a man named Lee Mendelson, who, among other things, produced Charlie Brown Christmas and all the original Peanuts specials, the first batch we all grew up on. And he was close with Schulz, and I was involved in several projects that involved Schulz. And we just got along fine. I cannot claim I knew him as well as I knew some other people in comics, but I got to spend some time with him and talk with him, and I found him delightful and unassuming and a lot less conceited than I would have been if I had that kind of money and fame.
We talk about Peanuts quite a bit on this podcast because both of us are huge fans growing up in the 70s with those Lancer paperbacks and just really.
I'm a little older than you, so I grew up with the Holt Reinhardt paperbacks. Okay. And I still have mine, and they are falling apart from having been read too damn many times.
We have a few running jokes here about the Peanuts in terms of the early days, like Lucy with the pupils, the weird eyes. How that when you saw some of the early stuff, because you read every strip chronologically, what jumped out that was like, oh, this changed pretty quick?
Well, so a lot of the things didn't change pretty. What changed pretty quick for me was the fact that Lucy suddenly gained about 3 years on one day. And the same thing happened later on with Linus. I think Mr. Schulz introduced the idea of some young children who couldn't speak in the strips, and then decided that they weren't as interesting as kids who could speak and had some sort of personality emerging. So he quickly aged them. Yeah. Although he resisted that temptation with Sally Brown and later with Rerun. But the thing that you find when you go chronologically, it isn't as abrupt to see the characters change because it's a very gradual process. I am told that when they put together the first Peanuts book ever and the first collection ever, they had to pick out about a certain number of strips, I don't know how many, over the first 2 years. And when Schulz looked back at the proof sheets, he didn't want to include the early ones because the characters had changed so much. He was kind of shocked himself to look back because the changes over the day is like watching a pot boil. It's so gradual you never see it actually happening. Yet he suddenly looked and said, gee, I've changed Charlie Brown so much in the last 18 months that I don't want to see the early strips that much. So that first paperback is very light on the first year. It's got enough to get a sense of that, but he emphasized the second and third, when he was into the third year at that point more. And it has only been fairly recent that it was possible to collect the early years. They finally have been reprinted in a couple of different formats and will be available forever. I had the great experience. I could read them online because I got the access to a secret website that I guess I shouldn't be talking about, that the Schulz Museum maintains. It has all the strips online and cross-index. So I could just sit there and type in Pigpen, and they show me all the Pigpen strips, or Schroeder playing Brahms, and they showed me all the showed her playing Brahms strips, whatever. But I just went year by year, and I sat here, and I think I did about 3 to 4 years a day for however long that took. And sometimes I get lost in them. My girlfriend would come in and say, "Mark, it's 3 a.m. You know, I'm getting lonely in there." I go, I go, "Okay, I just wait a minute. I got to see how the ball game turns out."
I think we know. The first year, I remember the first Essential Peanuts hardback came out, and that was the first time I had ever seen a lot of those strips. They were never ever reprinted to that point, correct?
I don't know the history of that. One of the great things about doing this book was that I was dealing with the people at the Schulz Museum and in Schulz's office who know everything. In fact, if you ask them a question they don't have the answer to, they're thrilled because they've got something new to explore and go research. And this book was I wish politicians these days were fact checked like I was on this book, because they checked every date and every quote and every insinuation that I put into the book, and caught me occasionally getting a word wrong or something. But they know this stuff better than I do. And if you go to you've been to the Schulz Museum in Santa Rosa, get up there.
Yeah.
Go there. I'll tell you something to do while you're there. No one else will tell you this. Across the street from the museum, there is Snoopy's ice rink. Schulz owned an ice rink, and for a while he had his office where he drew the strip upstairs in the ice rink, and he liked going in and sitting up there. And then he could walk downstairs if he wanted and watch the little kids skating, or he could go to the snack bar or call down and say, "Hey, I'd like an English muffin, or heat me up some soup," whatever. So I'm sitting with my friend Sergio and Jeannie Schulz in the snack bar in the ice rink, and it's very cold in there for obvious reasons. And we look over, and there's all these little kids, 10 years old, give or take a year or two, skating, and they're all bundled up. They all, have that 6 layers of, fabric on them, and they're skating. And the music that's playing in there at one point is the music from Charlie Brown Christmas.
Oh,
and I look over, and it's just like, this is a scene from Charlie Brown Christmas come to life. That kid is probably Schroeder. That's probably Linus over there. That kid with the dust cloud around him, we know who he is, and it was just so charming. I just sat there and wanted to watch it all day. It was like art imitating life, imitating art, imitating life, imitating art, imitating life, or the other way around. So if you go up to the museum, you can spend all day. You can spend several days there and not see it all. But make a point of going across the street, and it's just seeing the ice rink. Sit down, have a cup of coca in the ice rink, and just watch little kids skate. It was just delightful.
That is something, being in Southern California, or in California period, I have yet to do. So if you want to promote what's happening on November 15th up there.
November 15th, Chip Kidd, Charlie Kochman, who's the editor of the book, myself, Paige Braddock, who's one of the people who is mentioned a lot in the book, who assisted Schulz. Patrick McDonald, a couple of other cartoonists, I think Rob Armstrong. We're going to have a whole batch of people who are involved with Peanuts, or people who love Peanuts, there for a celebration of the book. And there's going to be a panel discussion, and I'm going to sign my name 8,000 times on different things, probably.
Excellent. Since this is a comic book podcast, I always wondered why Peanuts always struggled to find a lasting home in comics. I mean, I know there was the Dell series, and then it was reprinted in the Gold Key series. And as people who, in the 5 years we've done this podcast know, I will never pass up an opportunity to show this off. So
that's a good thing. Leave that to me and your will. I can't give you an answer for that. I worked for Western Publishing for a number of years. I love the company. I learned a lot about it. I tell people that I think that company did an awful lot of things right that DC and Marvel did wrong, and vice versa, because they approached the comic business from a different aspect, more as book publishers than magazine publishers, and as people more conscious of the toy market and the activity book market than of what maybe interested Marvel or DC at the time. And the answer probably is that the books didn't sell as well as some other things. they put out an awful lot of stuff, and a lot of them, the ones with comic strips didn't do that well. As well as I don't think I can think they had a dozen more comics based on newspapers. I don't think the Beetle Bailey comics sold that well for them. I don't think
Nancy ran quite a while.
Nancy, and it was on and off quite a while. Yeah, I just think that maybe those characters don't lend themselves to longer stories as readily, or didn't then.
Yeah.
And also, you're getting peanuts for free in the newspaper every day, reading Dad's copy of the Times or the Herald or whatever it's in. I don't know that I can't give you a finite answer. Also, keep in mind that Schulz didn't really do the comic books,
right?
So maybe people sensed they were a little off. They were very faithful, and he approved them, and he did some work for them. He did some covers. I think he wrote 1 or 2 stories and such. But Peanuts was a unique creation. One of the things we emphasize in the book, because it's one of the things that kept leaping out at me, was it's one guy doing this strip for 50 years. It's one man doing the whole thing himself. If he had hired assistants to ink his backgrounds or suggest gags, no one would have faulted him. But he didn't want to do it that way. He wanted every strip to come out of his pen point, and every idea to come out of, go through his brain. And it's really an amazing body of work. Not too many other people. I used to think, nobody else had done it. Well, actually, as I mentioned in the book, I was introduced to Schulz at that first San Diego encounter in '74 by a man named Russell Myers, who was writing and drawing the Broomhilda strip, who was a friend of mine. And you know what Russell Myers is doing now? He's still writing and drawing Broomhilda. He's still at it. Wow. And he's like 2 years ahead on it. So if he drops dead tomorrow, the strip will still live on for 2 more years. Lovely man. And he introduced me to, quote, Sparky, unquote. I couldn't call him that. I'm just racist. Schulz kept saying, call me Sparky. And I go, no, thank you. No. I'm going to, I can't. Certain people you just can't get too familiar. I couldn't call Hugh Hefner Hef. I couldn't call Joe Barbera Joe. Some of these people, it's just tricky. I worked with Sid Caesar. I couldn't call him Sid. It's just an amazing body of work. And one of the things that I didn't really know, I guess I knew this, but I didn't really fully understand it, is that when Schulz retired from the strip, it was not by choice. It was medical necessity.
No.
If he had known that 8 months he wouldn't be able to draw anymore, or a year from now he wouldn't be able to draw anymore, and he decided to pick a finite time to end, we would have had a wonderful last 8 months or year of Peanuts where he maybe resolved some of the ongoing storylines, maybe did the last strip where Charlie tried to kick the football, or the last strip where Charlie Brown tried to fly a kite or tried to win a baseball game, or the last strip where Lucy and Schroeder came to more understanding than they ever had, whatever it was. And we were robbed of that. And he was robbed of that last bow, so to speak, because he did the strip, and one day he had to stop. And it was very
moment that would have been having Charlie Brown kick the football, or
maybe something like that. I don't want to put words in his mouth or ideas, and maybe he wouldn't have done that. I'd like to think he would have resolved that somehow. That the last strip would have been Charlie Brown kicking the football and running off. I finally did it, but maybe not, because the strip was unique to Schulz, and it only really worked for a lot of us in print when he did it.
Yeah,
there's some wonderful cartoons now being done that are extrapolating and building on what his foundation, but it had to come out of him, and his instincts were not yours or my instincts, which is why we don't have his money. And
you realize he wrote all the movies.
He wrote the TV shows, he wrote the movies, he wrote everything. Yeah. No, the thing that's amazing about it is, to me, is he was so humble. I wouldn't be that humble if I'd had that kind of money and that kind of fame. And he understood his reach. He understood how popular the strip was. He understood, and yet I mentioned this on another podcast. So if anybody watched that, forgive me for repeating myself. You can get. I've interviewed great people. You know how many panels I've done at Comic-Con. I've interviewed or known an amazing number of brilliantly creative people. I have encountered a staggering percentage of the people who, when I was young, created the TV shows and cartoons and movies that I loved. And a lot of them, most of them, maybe all of them, would talk endlessly about themselves and their accomplishments and their achievements. It was no trouble to get people to talk about their own work and their own glories and their own fame. But with Schulz, he kept the conversations I had with him kept drifting over to comic strip history and other comic books. And he liked the fact that I could tell him stories about cartoonists that he knew the cartoonists, he didn't know the stories. I told him a lot of stories about Walt Kelly, who I knew a lot about. I told him stories about comic books, about Jack Kirby, about some of the other people. I told him about some things about Western publishing and how they operated. And he was fascinated with that. And we talked about, L.Z. Seeger and Popeye, which he loved. We talked about Crazy Cat, which he loved. We talked about all these other strips, including some obscure ones. We even talked about new and upcoming strips that he had spotted the greatness of before the mass public did. I remember we talking about For Better or For Worse, when I wasn't even that familiar with the strip. He told me, "Oh, you look at that strip. That's going to be a big strip." The subject kept drifting away from him, as the subject will not keep drifting away from me in this interview here.
That's the best segue I could ask for, because I do want to pivot to you. And I told you this before we started recording. I don't think you get enough praise for your work and what you've done for comics. And everyone that, again, 5 years worth of running jokes. I will not say Blackhawk the way I normally say it. I will spare Mark that. We have a running joke here, but I love Blackhawk.
I loved doing Blackhawk too. It was one of my favorite things I've done in my career. And, and every time I'm at a convention, somebody brings some of those up for me to sign. And I can't resist flipping through them and thinking how lucky I was to be teamed with this man, Dan Spiegel, who drew most of them. He was such a wonderful artist and a good friend. And I had a great association with that man.
You talk about Dan Spiegel, so underrated. There is one issue that I'm blanking on now. It's a Domino issue, and there's a full page splash. I'll show it here when I edit it, of Domino, and her story is around her. It's so beautifully composed. Why is he not up there with the Dave Stevens and the Bruce Timms of the world when it comes to that sort of art?
Well, sometimes people are slow to discover those people. I mean, I knew how good Bruce Timm was years before anybody else did. I knew Bruce in the animation business and how outstandingly talented he was. I knew I met Dave Stevens at Jack Kirby's house in 1970. How long I knew Dave.
Where he just exploded. Sorry, Mark.
So anyway, and I know how good he was. That I have some drawings that I could have blackmailed Dave by trying to print that he gave me that he did in 1970. He would just been horrified to, Dave was very fussy about how his work was presented. But I think it's very difficult in the DC Marvel world to be a superstar artist if you never drew Superman or Batman or Spider-Man, those books. I think it's also tough if you weren't writing the hot book, or drawing the hot book, whatever it was at that moment, regardless of whether everybody liked it or not. There were books that certainly reflected well on the people who did them for sales reasons. And sometimes people just love them. I don't know. I stopped caring about sales in what I was doing. At some point, all I wanted was, if they just let me keep doing it, I don't care. If it's the top book or the bottom book, I just want to keep doing it if I enjoyed it. And that's kind of how I approached my comic book career for most of the time. Well, I just enjoy doing Groo. I don't even know what Groo sells these days. I just enjoy doing it because it's my best friend Sergio, and we have great time working on it. We have, we have this running gag, Sergio and me. We'll disagree on something. We're not talking about an issue, and I said, I think the Sage should come in on page 3. He said, no, Mark, the Sage should come in on page 4. And we discussed it for a minute or two, and then we realized, oh my God, we can't do this. We're having an argument. We're not allowed to have arguments on this book. And then eventually he'll say, Mark, We never have an argument. And I go, yes, we do. How dare you say that? And we argue about not having an argument just for fun. But it's just a great experience to do it. And if it bleeds through and the readers enjoy it, great, because then we get to keep on doing it.
That 80s run of Blackhawk, though, is a perfect example of that. It was almost like DC was miffed that it was selling.
Some people there who had predicted it wouldn't were angry. Yes, they never. I actually so often people say to me, "I heard it was a top seller in spite of that." No, it was never a top seller. They just didn't lose as much money on it as they thought they would.
Right.
And they suddenly, all of a sudden, were offering Dan and me every other book in the place to do, and Dan didn't want to leave Blackhawk, and I didn't want to leave Dan. So I mean, we just. It was a very nice little run for a while there, and I was proud of it, and I was proud of Crossfire and a few other comics I've done. There are a number I will not mention, and if you bring them up, I will swear that the other Mark Evanier wrote those. I don't understand why there's two guys in the world with the same name like that, but I don't feel like I've ever had a real job in my life. I'm 73 years old now. I've been writing since I was 17. I've never done anything but write, or things that are adjunct to that, like editing or directing. I never have so I don't feel like I've ever had a job. I just feel I've made my passions pay for this place.
Yeah. What's your take on Blackhawk's legacy today? Is it something that could work for a modern audience, or is that time past?
I don't know what works for an audience these days, and I would tend to think that there are people running comic book companies that would agree that they don't know either. I think this right now, the business is in a state where nobody really knows what's selling. There's no outstanding book that they're going, let's imitate that one.
Right.
There's a lot of good comics around, and there are comics that sell, but usually they now say that's because of the writer or artist, the particular person. An imitation is not automatically going to sell the way that in once upon a time, if Marvel had a hot book with this type of a character, and DC could come out with a hot book with this kind of character, and that doesn't work anymore because the audience is much more creator sensitive, and the people who order the comics at the stores buy them based on who's writing and drawing them, the advance orders when they solicit them from whichever distributor hasn't gone bankrupt this week. So I don't know, and I really don't follow the comp. Here's my relationship with the comic book business. About every 3 months, someone who's an editor at a legitimate company calls me up and he says, "Mark, we want to have a book like this. It's either an existing property or some kind of a comic they want that they think I could deliver for them." And we talk a little about it, and I say, "Sure, this sounds great. I want to do this." And they say, "Great, we'll get back to you." And I never hear from them again. And 2 weeks later, someone calls up and says, "Hey, did you hear that friend of yours got fired?" And it's kind of like when I have one of those phone calls where they ask me to do it, I say, "Great, we'll get started soon." And I hang up. I think, well, that's fun. It would be nice to do that book, but I doubt I will.
Well, speaking of bankruptcy, let's talk about Eclipse and Pacific.
Okay.
Crossfire was such an interesting hybrid. It's part Hollywood satire, part superhero, part noir. What inspired that mix? Just all the things you like?
Yeah, I've been very lucky that usually most, not all, there are some terrible exceptions to this, but most of the comic books I've done in my life, I got to do pretty much what I wanted. I had an editor who trusted me. When I did Blackhawk for DC, we had 4 editors in however long we did that book. I was the last of them. But I was really the editor, in fact, after the first issue, because Len Wein, who was the first editor, I wrote the first issue. He sent it to me. I sent it to the script. He said, okay, sent it to Dan with no changes. Then Dan sent it to me. Usually the artist would deliver it to the New York office. Dan sent it to me, and I went through it, and I looked at Dan's work, and I said, God, he tells the story so clearly, I don't need this balloon here anymore. I could read letters, something. I could forge lettering well in those. I could do my own lettering corrections and touch-ups on art and stuff like that. There was one time, here's something that will drive people nuts. There was one time I wanted to take a balloon out of one of Dan's stories. The stories had all drawn, and I wanted to take the balloon out and finish the art in the space where the balloon was, but I wasn't a good enough artist to put that line in. I'm sitting here thinking, gee, I'll ruin the art if I try to fix it. I'm not good. I can draw a little bit, but I'm not good enough to do that thing. What am I going to do here? And just when the phone rang and Dave Stevens called me and said, hey, Mark, I'm in your neighborhood. Can I drop by? And I go, oh, okay. And I got Dave to do the art correction there. And I can't remember which panel it was. Someplace in there, there's about that much space that Dave Stevens drew. And I think there's one space where Sergio did art corrections on it. Wow. And there's one space where Carol Lay did art corrections on it. I just had a lot of artists coming through visiting me. So, anyway, so after the first issue, they just said, well, Mark, you just send the scripts to Dan. He'll draw them. He'll send them to you. Send them in. So Marv Wolfman took over as editor, and that's how we worked. Then Ernie Colon took over as editor, and that's how we worked. And then Ernie left the company, and they had this meeting where they said, okay, we need someone else at Blackhawk. And Marv Wolfman, I'm told, said, hey, Evanier's already editing. Why don't we just give him the extra fee? And they said, okay. And I became an editor without asking for it or whatever. They just called it. Oh, said, by the way, Mark, you're the editor. You're getting X dollars more per issue. And I went, oh, thank you. And that was it. That's how I became an editor of a book at DC. And almost immediately after it was printed in the fanzines that I was taking this over, some guy sent me a 24-page Blackhawk script he had written just for the occasion, basically saying, here, I mean, he didn't say this in this terms, but here, wouldn't you like to replace yourself? Here, why don't you buy this script from me instead of you writing the book you love writing? I didn't even read a script. I just sent it back to him. I said, I'm sorry. If I'm off the book, send this to whoever replaces me. I'm not giving up the writing. That's the part I like.
Was that Bill Dubé?
No, it wasn't. It wasn't Bill Dubé. No,
for people who don't get that reference, that's who is supposed to take over the book after Mark.
Bill and Carmen Infantino did 3 issues after Dan and I left it, and they were going to cancel the book. And then for some reason they changed their mind. We agreed to stay till the end, and then they reneged on it and said we're going to do 3 more issues. And they gave it to Bill and Carmen Infantino, and they did 3 issues, and they didn't print them. They said they were so terrible.
Oh yeah.
Wow! I wouldn't say that about deceased people, except that Bill Dubé deserves terrible things to be said about him in retrospect.
Well, why did, for people that don't know, explain why DC decided to revive Blackhawk in 1983?
I was told, and this is one of those stories that I never got the full story on, but Steven Spielberg had somehow said, hey, maybe I'd like to do a movie of Blackhawk. This is when Mr. Spielberg, could have said to any movie studio in town, I want to do a $80 million movie about prune Danish, and they would have written the check right at that spot, anything you wanted. And so someone in the Warner Brothers hierarchy said, Spielberg's interested in this. Let's make sure that the rights, let's kind of sell it to ourselves. So we won't have to sell it to somebody else. If he makes a movie, he'll make it for us. And he's never made that movie. I keep hearing reports that he's working on it. He's thinking of doing it. He might start it next year. I have no idea if they'll ever do it or not. But at that moment, there was this moment then when they thought, gee, that Spielberg may do Blackhawk. And then somebody else, I don't know who, said, gee, maybe we ought to start the comic up again. Because if he's going to do it, we could do a lot of merchandising of the property, but we can't really do a comic that we don't have any faith in to put out. So they had at that time a writer and artist, and I will not tell you these names, and you're not going to guess them, who they hated. Not hated. The guy had 2 guys under contract whose work they were very unhappy with. And they were like, we got to give these guys something. They've got a contract. We got to pay them. And they said, let's put them on Blackhawk and have them do the book as a quarterly, 4 issues a year, when no other comic book in the world was quarterly from DC or Marvel. And they assigned it to Len Wein to edit. And Len said, okay, the first thing I'm going to do is let's make it monthly, and I'll get rid of that writer and artist. And Len talked them into changing the plan. I suspect, this is a theory, that he had in the back of his mind that he'd write it. Mm-hmm. And then he realized he didn't have the time. He was too far behind on other stuff. Len was a lovely guy, but he was always behind on something. So he called me up one day and he said, we're going to do Blackhawk again, and I'm trying to figure out who to have draw it, because that was the tough for him. He knew a lot of writers want to write it. And he said, who could draw that comic? We can't get Russ Heath. He named all the great war comic artists that DC had employed in the last few years. None of those guys are available. And I said, Len, there is no human being who's ever worked in comics who draws airplanes better than Dan Spiegel.
Mm-hmm.
And Len, there was a pause, and Len goes, "Oh my God, you're right." He just yelled it. My God, that's all right. Wasn't that thing? Yes, yes, yes. You think he'll do it? And I said, only if you ask him. So he said, "What's his number?" I gave him Dan's number. He called Dan and said, "I want you to draw Blackhawk for me." And Dan said, "What the hell is Blackhawk?" He'd never seen the comic book. He didn't know anything about it. And Len says, "It's about a bunch of guys in airplanes." And Dan says, "I'll do it." That's all he knew about it. And Dan said, "You got to write. Is there someone write? Are you going to write it?" And Len says, "No, I got to find a writer who can do it." And Dan Spiegel, who I'd worked with on Scooby-Doo comics a lot, and a lot of Hanna-Barbera comics and things like that. And I did the Korak comics for overseas for a while with Dan, and some Tarzan things with him also. And we were good friends. We got along great. Dan says, "Why don't you have Mark write it?" And Len goes, "Hey, that's a good idea. Let me call him back. I'll call him up. Talk to you later." So he calls me up and he says, "Do you want to write Blackhawk for Dan Spiegel to draw?" And it's one of those, half a second thing. "Oh, yes, I'll do that. Yes, okay." At first he says to me, "What era would you set it in?" And I said, "You should set it in World War II," which they'd never done.
No.
Even World War II was kind of vaguely in an amorphous war that we never knew when it was. I never understood in the 60s. These guys are at war. I don't know what war it was. And I don't think they did either. They were fighting giant, gorillas. The giant gorilla war. The time forgot.
Yeah.
And so I said, set it at World War II. There is no one alive except maybe Jack Kirby, who's going to invent a better master villain than Hitler.
Mm-hmm.
And this is before Trump. And so then he said, "Great. Can you get me a script of the first issue?" And I said, "Sure." And just then my caller ID showed that Dan Spiegel was calling me. I said, I'll call you tomorrow. Then I got to talk to Dan. And I go switch over to Dan and he says, "Hi, what's Blackhawk?" And I told him, what?
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, that's it. That's the story.
Was there ever any thought, because I know Dave Cockrum was a huge Blackhawk fan.
Before they ever approached, in that list of artists they couldn't get was Dave Cockrum. Dave wanted to do it. He loved Blackhawk. And at that point, Marvel was offering him a ridiculous number of money to do some projects for them. And DC said, "Hey, if we can get Cockrum, let's put him on a book that's going to sell." Because they thought this book would not sell no matter who did it.
Right.
Why waste Dave Cockrum on a book that's not going to sell when Dave could, launch another Teen Titans someplace, or take over the Legion or something.
I believe he was on X-Men in '83 as well.
Yeah. I think he was doing some X-Men stuff. And Marv Wolfman Marv wanted to write it, but the same thing. They said, no, Marv, no, you don't want to write this. It's not going to sell.
Yeah.
So, and I didn't care if it sold as long as I got to do it with Dan.
Yeah.
And the nice part of here's the nice thing, because it didn't intersect with the rest of the DC universe in any way, they left me alone. I could do whatever I wanted. I didn't have to check with someone else if I wanted to use, a Batman villain. I didn't have to check with somebody else if I wanted to have Wonder Woman guest star or anything like that. I just took it away from all that. Wow. And people would say to me, "Which Earth is it on?" I go, "I don't know." I don't care. It's on Blackhawk Earth, whatever it was, because the book did not intersect at any point with anything else. So I didn't have to check with anybody at all, which is what Jack Kirby always wanted to do in the comics when he was writing and drawing them for DC and Marvel. He just wanted to be left alone. He didn't want to have somebody tell him, no, you can't use this villain here because he's in that comic that month. And it was kind of neat because Dan lived in Santa Barbara and I live in Los Angeles. And the halfway meeting point between Santa Barbara and Los Angeles, if we wanted to get together for lunch, meet for lunch someday, was Thousand Oaks, where Jack Kirby was living. So I could drive out to this restaurant and have lunch with Dan and give him Blackhawk scripts and discuss things like that and go over cover layouts. And then I could drive over and see the Kirbys. And one time I went to the Kirby's house And Roz says, "Hey, let's go out to lunch. We haven't had lunch yet. Let's go to lunch." And I go, "I just came from lunch." They go, "Well, you can come with us." And we got in my car and I drove them back to the same restaurant I'd been in with Dan Spiegel, like half an hour earlier. We got the same table. And the waitress comes up and says, "What would you? Boy, you must be hungry. Didn't that cheeseburger fill you up already?" So.
Well, you mentioned working with Dan on Scooby-Doo, which you worked with him when you were packaging Hanna-Barbera comics for Marvel.
I worked with him before that when Gold Key was doing the comic.
Gold Key. But can you tell everyone who Reg Everbest was?
Reg Everbest was Steve Gerber's name spelled inside out.
And why was that a sneaky thing at the time?
Because somebody had told Steve he'd never work for Marvel again, and Marvel was printing these comics. So immediately I said, "Well, I've got to get Steve Gerber in a Marvel comic." I was writing. The deal was I was supposed to write all the ones Marvel published, and I just gave that. I gave one or two out to other people that against the wishes of Hanna-Barbera management, because I was supposed to write everything. But what happened was Gold Key published Scooby-Doo for a while, and then they had a fight with Hanna-Barbera, and Hanna-Barbera took the licenses to Charlton.
Good move.
Charlton did work that Hanna-Barbera could not sell overseas. The foreign publishers didn't want to buy the reprint rights. They bought the reprint rights to the Gold Key comics, but they wouldn't buy the reprint rights to the Charlton comics. So they set up a new division of Hanna-Barbera, and they hired a man named Chase Craig, who had been my editor at Gold Key, and he had retired. They hired him to come out of retirement and work 2 days a week running the comic book division for Hanna-Barbera. Now, this is a true story that no one believes, but I swear to you it's true. I don't have a witness. You just have to believe. I'll take a polygraph, okay? I wrote the TV show, was a writer on the TV show Welcome Back, Kotter, for a year. And at the end of that year, I decided not to come back for another season. And my girlfriend at the time was a girl named Christine, who had been one of the classroom extras on Kotter. If you look at some of the reruns, she's in the background, or she's got one line talking to Vinnie Barbarino and such. Lovely lady. And after the end of the second season wrap party, which we both attended, keeping our relationship secret because she didn't want people to think she didn't want people to think she'd gotten a job by sleeping with one of the writers. That the story is the old joke, the Polish starlet who sleeps with the writers. Well, and she couldn't have in this case because I had no hiring power and she was on the show before I was. But anyway, so we go back to my place. We wake up the next morning, and I'm unemployed for the first time in my writing career. I have nothing to write that day for money. And she says to me, "So if you could have any job in the world, Mark, what would you like?" And I said, "I don't know. I want to write everything I ever loved as a kid. I can't." She said, "Okay, if you could get back any job you had before writing, which would you like?" And if she'd asked me 10 minutes later, I might have given a different answer. But I said, "Well, I really liked writing the Scooby-Doo comic books for Gold Key. A wonderful artist named Dan Spiegel drew them. The editor was a man named Chase Craig, who I loved. Gold Key treated me very well. They paid me decently. I had a very good experience there, and they left me alone." And she said, "Well, can you get that job back?" And I said, "No. Chase Craig retired. He's not working at Gold Key anymore. Gold Key doesn't have the rights to do Hanna-Barbera comics anymore. Dan Spiegel's drawing for other publishers now. He doesn't. So I can't get Chase Craig. I can't get Scooby-Doo. I can't get Hanna-Barbera. I can't get Gold Key. And so now the subject changed to, okay, where the hell was her next job? 15, 20 minutes later, the phone rings. I swear to you, on the other end of the line, it's, "Hey, Mark, this is Chase Craig. Listen, I've come out of retirement to edit a new line of comic books by Hanna-Barbera. We're doing a Scooby-Doo comic book, and Dan Spiegel's drawing it, and he asked if he could get you to write it." And I said, and I went like, "Is Rod Serling in the room?" All right. All of a sudden, I've got Hanna-Barbera, I've got Chase Craig, I've got Scooby-Doo, I've got Dan Spiegel offered to me. And I said, "How many comics are you doing?" He said, "We're doing 4 of them. We're doing the Flintstones, Dynamite, Yogi Bear, and Scooby-Doo." And I said, "Who's running the other ones?" And he said, "I don't have anybody yet. I just started today on this job." And I said, "I'll write the Scooby-Doo comic if I can write the other 3 as well." And he said, "You got them. You want to have lunch today?" And that afternoon, I was sitting at my computer at home, not computer, my Selectric typewriter at home. This is 1975, 76, whatever it was, writing a Scooby-Doo comic book story for Chase Craig for Dan Spiegel.
Amazing. Wow. That Marvel run of the Hanna-Barbera books was pretty short. Did they just sell?
So somebody at Hanna, what happened was, this is a very long story, and this podcast will last, into your next 4 if I tell the whole thing. But basically, I went through this exact same thing with the Edgar Rice Burroughs Company, who took the rights to Tarzan away from Gold Key because Gold Key wouldn't publish more Edgar Rice Burroughs comics. Hanna-Barbera took the rights away from Gold Key because they wouldn't publish more Hanna-Barbera comics. Did I just say that right? Okay. Yeah. So in the case of Hanna-Barbera, what happened was they put this new division together, and they had the idea to start a Hanna-Barbera comic book company. They had the funding, they had the clout, they had the deep pockets, they had the properties, it had a track record, and they couldn't get distribution. They went to DC and they went to Independent News and all the other major distributors, and they said no. And finally, one of the distributors, which was Curtis, said no, but Marvel will publish them. And Curtis went to Marvel and said, here, we want you to put these comics out. And there were people at Marvel who hated the concept that a comic book was not produced by them.
Mm-hmm.
You could not, the office creates the comics after all, under its strict supervision. The writers and artists just take orders and do what they're told. So they made this deal to do the comic. We would do the comic books, and we did them simultaneously for the American market, but also we did a lot for the European market as well, because they were, certain countries were running old Hanna-Barbera shows for the first time, and they wanted comic books of those characters that might not have sold in America because they weren't on TV in America at the time. Does that make any sense?
Yeah.
So we started producing these comics, and at some point Chase just retired again. He said, "Here, you take over the whole division. I don't want to work this hard." So I became the editor of the comic book division there. But the people at Marvel didn't like doing the comics. They didn't understand why Marvel was publishing stuff that they didn't write and they didn't draw. And at some point, they got rid of the line. It was selling. They said, people at Marvel made a point of telling me the book sold terribly. Hanna-Barbera showed me the documents on which Marvel paid royalties, the royalty statements, and the sales looked pretty damn good to me on those.
Yeah.
So, you do the math from here. I that's all I know. I know is we stopped doing the American ones. We kept doing the European ones for a couple of years.
Luckily, that never happened at Marvel ever again, where they were upset that another editorial team was publishing comics.
In your career, were you ever writing 4 books simultaneously?
Yes. Yeah. Well, when I was writing the Hanna-Barbera comics, I could write as many as I wanted. I wrote all the American ones, and I could write as many of the European ones as I had time for. And then later, I had a similar deal with the Edgar Rice Burroughs Company. We were producing Tarzan and Korak comics for overseas, and I could write as many of them as I wanted. And I wrote all the Koraks and a few of the Tarzans. I used some other writers on the Tarzans and to spread the work around. But there was a point there where I was writing Groo, or whatever I do on Groo, for Marvel. I was writing Blackhawk for DC. I was writing DNA Agents for Eclipse, and then later Crossfire. There was another one in there. There was a point where there were 4, and writing 4 comics a month does not mean you get 1 week for each script. It means sometimes all 4 had to be written in the same week. So I didn't really count it that way, but we did. Yeah, I was writing TV shows at the same time. Wow. I had this period of my life when I was writing 2 or 3 TV. I was the story editor usually of a Hanna-Barbera show, usually Richie Rich, for a couple of years there. I was writing specials for Dick Clark and for Sid and Marty Krofft. For 3 years there, I wrote That's Incredible. I wrote a whole bunch of sitcom things, and all sorts of. You think I'd have some money?
I will toot your horn for you, since you're not going to go here. The Hanna-Barbera stuff is not. Each comic is not one story, Richard. It's 3 or 4 stories per issue. So the volume is incredible.
Right. That is
well,
great.
It's I like writing. I like writing very long stories, and I like writing very short stories, because with short stories, you come up with a punchline, and then you just write to that.
Right.
Telling a joke to someone, in 6 pages, you're going to get to some good end panel, and it's going to be a logical punchline.
Right.
Long stories are fun because you can go different places in them, and you can try different nuances. I did a issue of Crossfire once where I put in like a 4 or 5 page car chase with no dialogue, because Dan Spiegel drew cars so well he could handle it. There are very few other artists in the world who could have pulled that off, and I was playing right into Dan's strengths. I wouldn't write a 4 or 5 page, car chase story for a 6 page story. You can try different things that way.
Was Crossfire ever close to being option for film or TV?
Yes. Yeah. I wrote a pilot script for CBS for it.
Like DNA Agents, but never happened?
Yeah. I didn't write the DNA Agents was option for CBS also at a different time, and I did not write the pilot for that. Somebody else did. Actually, they had 3 pilots written by 3 different writers before. They actually did finally come to me and ask me to rewrite the 3rd script. But by that point, what happens is if a pilot is around too long at the networks, nobody wants to get behind it.
Right.
That's the previous regimes, because at network TV at that time, it was kind of like, if my boss calls, get his name. I don't know who it's going to be this week. So, the person we first pitched, I pitched DNA Agents to CBS. They loved it, and the person who loved it was gone in 3 months. Things like that. So, we came very close with a couple of those things, and we got paid pretty well.
Those executives, they want ownership over. They want to be able to say, "I found this and I shepherd this."
Well, not always. I'll tell you. One of the guys I wrote, the what was it? One of the DNA Agents pilots was. One of the DNA Agents. I wrote. We were a couple. I actually wrote another DNA Agents pilot later on for another deal. One of the guys I wrote for had been the head of CBS for years before that. When you leave the network, they give you some development deals, so you go into private production. And he was a guy named Kim LeMaster, and I got along great with Kim, and he was a good guy. And they wouldn't buy DNA Agents from him either, but he wanted it because it was a project he had the power to buy a show, but he didn't have the power to buy that one. So I asked him at that point. I said, has anyone, in all the times you were heading the network up, how many pitches did you take where someone came in and said, here's a great new show I want to put on the air? He said, at least 1,000. I said, okay, how many times did they pitch a show to you and you said immediately on the spot, I am buying that show and doing it just the way the guy pitched it? And he said twice. 2 out of 1,000. And the 2 shows were Magnum PI and the Newhart show where he ran the inn. Because the guy who pitched to whoever it was came in, and the whole thing was figured out. They had the cast. They had Tom Selleck. Was it Tom? Yeah, Tom Selleck, and the supporting cast figured out, and they had the first script figured out, and it was just a matter of saying, yes, we'll take this. And he bought those 2 shows, and they were both big hits. Right? Wow. That does not happen very often.
No.
Because usually you have so many people there who want to have a piece of the action. I don't mean ownership. I mean, they want to be able to say, yeah, this is my show.
Right.
It's a very strange environment to work in. It's very political. And it was a very great rest from working on TV shows and pilots, which might get on or might get canceled, to then go write a comic book at home. I wrote 1 issue of the Welcome Back. I wrote 2 issues of the Welcome Back Kotter comic book. And it was a lot more fun because, Vinnie Barbarino didn't come up to me and say, I don't like my line here. I could make him say whatever he wants. Actually, John Travolta never said that to me the whole time I was on the show. Other actors in the show did, but he didn't.
What is going on with Crossfire and DNA Agents? Why
Nothing.
An omnibus or reprinting of these things?
Well, we've had a few. I think we've done some reprintings that nobody noticed. We keep talking about doing another one. I actually have been working on, and this is, as projects go, this is on my list of, 14th from the top. I've been working on a novel of the DNA Agents, which and Will Mineo, who co-created the comic book with me and drew most of them. He says he'll come out of retirement and draw the covers.
There you go.
Like that. But I kind of lost interest in the comic book when it became a chore to find a new artist each couple months.
Yeah, there's a point there.
And Eclipse was not doing well. Eclipse was just being, shoved off the stands. They had a flood. Their whole office got flooded out, and they were never the same. They were good people, but they had a problem getting their comics. One of the reasons, when I was doing Blackhawk, I may have told this story on my blog at some point. I was friends with a guy named Bill Leibowitz, who ran the Golden Apple comic book shop. Later on, we had a feud and didn't speak again. But Bill took me down. They had a little association of local dealers in Southern California, and they would have a meeting every so often in the back room of one of the stores and talk about how to maximize their profits and selling comics. They were competitors, but they weren't competitors. And he took me down there as a guest, and they asked me questions for an hour about the industry and how does it work and why do they do this and why did they put this guy on this book and why do they write this and why don't they put the comics out we wanted them to put out. That was the whole gist of it. And I said, okay, now I want you guys to tell me how I can get Blackhawk to sell more, because at that point we were kind of on the cusp of cancellation. We were basically being saved at that moment by Germany buying the reprint rights. Germany was paying enough to put the book into profit because they bought the reprint rights. Now, ask me, why was Germany buying the reprint rights to a comic book that was all about killing Germans? I don't know, but they did. And subsequently, when they decided to stop doing that, and that's when DC's war comics went away. Mm-hmm. They would dabble in them a little bit afterwards, but without that German money, the war comics were not profitable. Anyway, so I said to these dealers, I said, how do I get the comic to sell more? And they said, you can't. This book's not hot. The company's not behind it. And they told me stories about them saying, hey, how about if we get Evanier and Spiegel in the store to do a signing? And the DC representative would say, you don't want them. That book's never going anyplace. You want Marv Wolfman and Dave Cockrum, or Marv Wolfman and George Perez to come in and talk about Teen Titans. They were discouraging us. And they admitted that. When Dick Giordano called me, he was the guy I reported to. He was the editor-in-chief or whatever his title was that week. He called me up and he said, we're going to cut Blackhawk from monthly to bi-monthly because Germany is not going to be buying the reprint rights anymore, and we don't think we can sustain it. And I knew this was coming, and I'd already told Dan what was going on. And I said, in that case, we'd like to leave the book, Dick. And he said, I don't blame you. We didn't treat you guys very well. You delivered a much better book than we wanted. And this is very rare. This was just struck me aside because in all my time at DC and Marvel, what I had experienced was if the book sells badly, the writer and or artist didn't do their job well. If the book sells well, the company did its job well. It's always the fault of the writer and artist. It's never the fault of the company. Even if the company decided to cancel a book with decent sales, they said, well, it's going down. Let's give up on it. The writer and artist have failed, So it was so unusual. And then they offered us other books. DC offered us other books, and they offered Dan a couple other things. So I knew he meant what he said. But Dan and I decided to leave it. And that meeting with the retailers is one of the things that convinced me there was nothing we could do to get the sales up outside of, getting Neil Adams to draw it or something.
It leads to tell everyone the story about the title of the last issue of your run of Blackhawk.
Well, as I mentioned, the editors at DC didn't know what I was doing. The editor of Blackhawk would call me up and he'd say, I got to get a cover done. What's the story about? I'd say, draw this or this or this, whatever. And then they wouldn't really know much about the issue until I handed in the finished art. They got the finished art, which I sent in from Dan. But DC was soliciting books ahead. So the sales department would call me and they'd say, what's in the December issue? And I would tell them the title and I'd tell them a summary, or I'd write something out and mail it to them. Steve Gerber had taught me about a thing called MCI mail, which existed then. This is in the early days. Here's something interesting. I was the very first person to ever deliver work to DC Comics by Federal Express. When Federal Express started, it was being used only by corporations for valuable manuscripts or deals, contracts. And I knew about it, and I sent in an issue of Blackhawk by Federal Express to DC overnight. And people at DC were calling me going, when did you mail this? How come we have it now? How much did that cost? MCI mail, you could send something to New York in 3 hours. They'd print it out. It was you would upload the script to MCI's phone number on your telephone-driven modem, which went at 2400 baud. Somebody listening to this will know what that meant. And then they would print it out and deliver it like a telegram to New York. And and Steve Gerber had used that a couple of times when things. And then I was also using the overnight pouch for ABC because I was working for ABC on some TV show, and I could send something to ABC, and they would deliver it to the ABC offices in New York the next morning. And I certainly worked that way. I found all these clever ways to turn stuff in overnight when nobody else could do that. Yeah, so I'd send in a piece of paper that said, "Here's the issue," and they wouldn't print it. When the solicitations came out, it would say, Teen Titans, here's the exciting story where the Wonder Girl does this and Robin and Changeling does this. And then underneath it would say Blackhawk, no information available at press time. And it would say, House of Mystery, 4 great mystery stories written by, Ernie Chan or whatever it was. And Blackhawk was the only one with no listing. And I'd keep talking and they'd say, oh, we didn't get it in time. No, I gave it to you. Well, we lost it. I don't know, whatever it was. Nobody really cared that much about Blackhawk. So when it came time to do the last issue, I called the story "No Information Available at Press Time." I even lettered it myself on the artwork. I just thought I wanted to have one be right once for a change, and boy, were they mad at me. Some people were really angry at me for doing that. But I thought, what are they going to do? Fire me?
Right. Or hire Bill DeBay. Richard is itching to get to his Groo questions.
All right. Itch away.
I grew up reading Groo. Groo was one of those comics I bought every month, and I enjoyed the lightheartedness of it and how serious Groo was about going about his business. It's 4 decades. It's hard to believe it's been 4 decades. How did you and Sergio keep it fresh without losing that original spirit?
Well, a lot of that is Sergio. I mean, you're talking about a guy who's drawn 38,000 cartoons in the margins of Mad Magazine. I mean, one of my all-time favorite comic books was The Fox and the Crow, which DC put out. And the guys who did that did hundreds of 6-page stories. It was only a couple writers, only 2 or 3 guys wrote them all, and 2 guys drew them all. And they did all these stories of the Fox and Crow. They were all fresh. They were all different. And they didn't have supporting characters in them. It was 1 fox and 1 crow generally. Ordinarily, a TV show will have a cast of 9 people. And then, 5th episode, they introduce this guy's uncle and then introduce this person's sister and this person's next door neighbor to get new stories. The Fox and Crow guys kept doing what we call in the TV trade internal stories. An internal story is one that comes completely from the regular cast, and it isn't about relative of the week or something like that. And I thought it was an interesting challenge to try and keep Groo fresh all the time. And the problem is that Sergio and I we get ideas, and I'd say to Sergio, "How about we do a story about this?" And he goes, "We did that in number 11." I go, he'd say, "How about a story like this?" And I say, "We did that in number 23." And that went on for a while. But eventually we come up with something we both liked. We're doing a mini series right now where I had the germ of the idea, and I said this to Sergio, and he didn't like it. He just thought it was a lousy idea, and I kept pitching him on it. And finally, I think he finally said, "Okay, Mark, we'll do it." And then we got into it. He started liking it, which is fine because I have to keep stopping people who call me the writer of Groo. I am the co-writer. I made jokes of my credit for the first 100 issues or so, just to not be called the writer. And I'd pick up every fan and they'd say, "Oh, Groo, written by Mark Evanier." No, it isn't. It's Sergio. A lot of those ideas are Sergio's, and a lot of the ideas people think are his are mine, and a lot of the ones people think are mine are his. We're very close friends. We get along great. We talk all the time. It's a comic done by 2 friends.
How did the 2 of you meet? How did you 2 start working creatively together?
We met in 1969, I believe. I was the president of a comic book club in Los Angeles that met every Saturday afternoon at a park up in West LA. And one of our members met Sergio and invited him to be a guest at a meeting. So Sergio came to a guest as a guest speaker. He was the one and only guest speaker we ever had in the 3 or 4 years the club existed. And then I ran into Sergio at a couple other events where cartoonists were, and we got along. And then, I worked for a little time for a company called Marvel Mania, which was doing posters and decals of Marvel characters and occasionally delivering orders. They occasionally filled orders. If you ordered, it was like a lottery. If you ordered for them and sent them money, it was about a 1 in 3 chance you'd get what you ordered. And then my partner Steve Sherman and I quit, and it was like a 2% chance after we left. And Sergio came by the office a couple of times. We went out to lunch. And then in the summer of 1970, forgive me if these stories run too long. Stop me if I'm wandering too much here. In the summer of 1970, Steve Sherman and I decided to go to New York on our own dime. To go to the DC offices because we were Jack Kirby's assistants, so we had some standing to go there. To go to the Marvel offices because we were doing the Marvel Mania stuff. We had some standing there. And to go to what was my first comic convention, which was the New York Labor Day, the July 4th convention that year, 1970, at the whatever hotel it was that year. And we went back to New York. And the first day we spent at DC, and it was an amazing day because I met Julia Schwartz and Dick Giordano and Marv Wolfman and Len Wein and Carmen Infantino and Joe Kubert and everybody, not everybody, but an awful lot of the people whose comics I'd grown up on. And it was very exciting. And then the next day we had an appointment at 10 a.m. to meet Stan Lee at Marvel offices. So just as we were leaving the hotel room, we were at the Statler Hilton, which is no longer there. Phone rings and it's Stan's secretary saying, Stan's got an emergency meeting, come at 2:00 instead. So we're all dressed up and ready to leave the hotel. And it's 10 a.m. or it's 9:45 or whatever it was. And we decided to sightsee because I had not been in New York since I was about 10. And Steve had not been in for almost as long. So we just decided to wander around New York and look at New York for a while. And we're walking down Madison Avenue, one of the busiest streets in the entire world. And we get to a corner and suddenly I hear someone yell, "Mi amigos." And I look catty corner across the street, and there's Sergio standing on the corner. And I could not believe that, A, he recognized me from afar, remembered my name, remembered who I was, and spotted me there. And we went over to talk to him, and we said, "Hey, what are you doing in New York?" And we told him we were going to the convention. He said, "Oh, I'm going to be at the convention too." And I said, "We went at the DC offices yesterday, and today we were going to see Marvel, but we stand with Stan Lee postponed, so we have an afternoon appointment." And Sergio says to us, "While you're in town, are you going to visit the Mad Magazine offices?" Now, I loved Mad Magazine. I grew up on Mad Magazine. I have a complete collection in the next room of every issue of Mad Magazine I've had since I was about 12 or 10. But it never occurred to us to go to anything other than the convention, the DC offices, the Marvel offices, and Jack Kirby had arranged for us to go spend a day with Steve Ditko, which we hadn't done yet. So I said, "No, we hadn't thought of going to the Mad offices. Where are they?" And Sergio says, "Right here. Come on." And he opens we go into this building he was just going to. He was going to the Mad offices. And we walked into the building, and this little sad-faced man with a portfolio is walking out. And I go, "That's Wally Wood." Who I had an appointment with. I also had an appointment to meet Wally Wood at the convention, which Jack had set up. But we go in, we met Al Feldstein and Bill Gaines and the whole staff of Mad Men. Angela Torres was there. And I thought, what's Angela Torres doing here? He doesn't draw for Mad, he draws for Sick. But he was there for. He had just turned in his first job for Mad. He'd switched over. He just joined the staff. So he was there. And we had a wonderful time in the Mad offices. And then we went to see Stan Lee and met Roy Thomas and Bill Everett and Ron Sean Romita and Marie Severin and Herb Trimpe and whoever was in the office. That Larry Lieber was there that day and people like that. And it was just a very amazing week. But I then end up spending most of that comic convention with Sergio. And we kind of bonded there and started talking and became friends. And we started hanging out together back in LA afterwards because he was living out here. And that association, seeing him all the time socially, turned into, let's work together. Have I answered your question?
Yes, that's amazing. That story is amazing. The fact that you rattle off all those names and you saw them in one visit would melt the brain of pretty much everybody listening to this podcast right now.
Well, it was a very fascinating thing. One of the things that was really weird is, when we walked into the DC offices, I had never been in a comic book company office before. All of a sudden, we jumped 4 months ahead in time because the issues they had on the walls, the things that were going on there, were the issues that were going to come out in 4 months for us. Mm-hmm. So all of a sudden, there was a new DC symbol on all the comics. Mm. They had taken the old DC bullet off and put a new one on. And all of a sudden, all the writer and artists had moved around because Carmen Infantino was playing chess with starting new books and moving talent around. And it was just like stunned. And at one point, I was alone. Steve was off doing something else. And I'm hanging around the office. And I became friends with a man named Nelson Bridwell, who was an assistant editor there, and a very brilliant man who was not treated very well by the business or by the people in it. And I see this portly, bald guy talking to the production department. And I thought, I think that's Mort Weisinger. Mm. And I went to Nelson and says, is that Mort Weisinger? He says, yeah, come on, I'll introduce you to him. And he introduced me to Mort Weisinger, who was there on his last day as a DC editor. He no longer had an office, but there was one more issue that he had to sign off on before it went out. And he was looking at the proofs of the issue and say, okay, change that and do that. And he was ready to leave. And Nelson introduces me to him. And Mort Weisinger had almost bought my first comic book script a couple of years earlier. He had asked me to submit to him because he liked my letters. Mm. And I'd written a script and he didn't like it. And then he wrote another one I didn't like. And then I wrote one that he liked. And it was going to be in an issue of Superboy. And then he got taken off that book. See, this is that whole pattern. If you like to hire Evanier, you lose your job. And that's happened more times than I'm relating to you. So I met Mort Weisinger. And I met, while I was there, Julia Schwartz took us to lunch, Steve and me to lunch. And I spent time with Joe Kubert and all those people. It was just amazing to meet all these folks and suddenly be, transported to that world. I met that first day at DC, I met Marv Wolfman, Len Wein, and a fellow named Mark Hannenfeld for the first time. And Len and Marv and I became lifelong friends from that moment on.
Talking a bit more about Groo. Groo started off in Pacific.
Groo started off with Eclipse Comics. It was a backup feature in Destroyer Duck #1.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
Sergio had created this character called Groo. He wanted to have his own character, but he wanted to own it. And at that point, if you said to DC or Marvel, certain people at DC or Marvel, here's this comic book. Oh, we'll publish that. And Sergio says, but I've got to own it. Oh, no, you can't own it. The copyright has to be in the order, a corporation. An individual cannot own a comic book character. And he'd say, sure, they can. And he'd show them examples of other people owning characters. And they wouldn't publish it. And so Steve Gerber was in this lawsuit with Marvel over Howard the Duck, which was a very unnecessary lawsuit. It could have been settled in 10 minutes if people had been more intelligent about it. If Marvel's lawyers had just said, okay, we'll give you this, Steve, and instead of spending all this money on lawyers. And Dean Mulaney of Eclipse Comics wanted to do a benefit comic to help Steve out. So Jack Kirby agreed to draw the lead story for no money. Alfredo Alcala agreed to ink it for no money. Tom Orzechowski agreed to letter it for no money. Steve and I co-edited the book, and I got together some other friends, do other features in it. And I went to Sergio and I said, here's a chance to publish Groo and keep the copyright. And Sergio had a 4-page story, a wordless 4-page story he'd written and drawn. And there was one word in it, I think, but it was a pantomime story. And I'd seen it and I said, I want that story. And we published it in Destroyer Duck #1. And immediately people said, where do we get more Groo? Where do we get more Groo? And Pacific Comics made us an offer, and we did, was it 8 issues of them, something like that. And then a very nice lady at Marvel named Carol Kalish called me up. She was in charge of the distribution. Carol Kalish is one of the people who made Marvel's sales at that time soar. She understood the direct market and invented a lot of things for it and tutored a lot of the other people. She was very instrumental. There are others as well. I don't want to slight others' contributions, but she was very respected for understanding the business and acting on it. And she came to me and she said, Eclipse Comics, Pacific Comics is in terrible financial trouble. They're going to have to fold. They're just overextended. And she told me all the reasons, which I don't pretend I fully understood. I don't understand a lot of the business end of this business. And she said, we want it. We want Groo and the Epic line. And we did 120 issues for them in 120 months with no fill-ins.
Mm-hmm.
How many other people have ever done that? We never missed a deadline. Book sold well for them. They would have kept it on for a while, but Sergio wanted to explore other possibilities, and we took it to Image Comics, and then we took it to Dark Horse, and we just, and someplace in there, Eclipse published one issue of it.
Yep.
And we sank a couple of companies along the way.
Yeah, Kamiko first.
We were never a Kamiko. We were never a Kamiko.
I'm just saying.
Don't blame that one on us.
All the bankrupt companies that have lain in waste since the 80s. Let's wrap this up with a quick lightning round. Richard, we'll go back and forth. Okay.
Okay.
Ready?
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
All right, Mark. Favorite Peanut strip of all time?
The one on my wall downstairs.
Fair enough.
It's in the book, and I won't want to describe it. Not the one on my wall is not in the book, but my favorite strip is in the book. I made sure they put it in, and I say it's my favorite in there. And if you'll read the book, I can't tell you what strip it is without telling the punchline.
Another reason to buy the book. All right,
Right.
Richard.
Favorite Groo gag or issue title?
Issue title. There's an issue where the most I ever made Sergio laugh was there was an issue where everybody was turning into each other because of a magic potion. And all of a sudden we had a scene where there were like 11 Groos in the panel. And somebody said something like, as any fool can plainly see. And all the Groos at once said in unison, we can plainly see that. And Sergio laughed so hard at that he called me up. I flew up to the phone, and it was I just heard laughter on the other end. I just sat here going, okay, when are you finished? Okay, you finished. Okay. He thought that was the funniest panel in the history of Groo. And I probably had some other. I loved the thing we did in a recent issue where I stuck him with drawing the same double spread in 3 pages consecutively. I just said to him, you're going to do that whether you like it or not. I want you to take 6 pages and draw the same panel 3 times, same double page panel 3 times with these things changing in them. And he did so brilliantly. That was one of my favorite things he ever did.
Most underrated comic you ever wrote, and it's okay if you say Hollywood superstars because that's my pick.
Fanboy, a book which nobody noticed. Mm-hmm. I was up at the DC offices at one point, and one of the marketing people said to me, oh, Mark, hey, are you doing something for us right now? I said, I'm doing a book called Fanboy. He says, what's that about? I said, it's about a kid who gets too deep into his comic books, and he gets too involved with them, and he lives in them, and he keeps crossing paths with them and fantasizing about being in them. And we have an issue he gets involved with the Superman world, an issue where he gets involved with the Batman world. And the guy says to me, oh, that sounds great. When is that scheduled to come out? I said, oh, number 4 just came out. So if they haven't heard of it in the hallways of DC, you're in trouble.
Title not available at press time.
Yeah.
A comic you loved as a kid that holds up today.
Fox and Crow, Sugar and Spike. I love the early Hanna-Barbera comic books that Western Publishing published through Dell and through Gold Key. And I loved Carl Barks' stories. They hold up. I just recently had occasion to read a lot of early issues of Mad Magazine again. And some of that, even though some of the references are dated, the jokes hold up. Especially if, like me, the dated references. Mm-hmm. I love the first 100 issues of Fantastic Four. I love the Ditko issues of Spider-Man, and a couple of years after that with Romita. I love a lot of comics, and I don't think it's nostalgia, because there are books that I read when I was a kid I just look at and go, why did I buy this? Why did I like this? But all right. Next question.
Last one. best piece of advice Jack Kirby ever gave you?
Well, Jack gave me a lot of advice. He never said this exactly to me, but he basically said, don't make comics your whole life. Do other things.
Mm.
And that was a very valuable thing. I've never, in all the years, I've been writing comics. Here's a frightening statistic. At the San Diego Con last year, there were 140,000 people at that convention. Only one person at that convention had older credits in professional comics than me. That was Don Glut. He was been in the business about 6 months before I was. The year before, there were 3 people who had been in the business longer than me. The year before that, there was 1 person who'd been in the business. Any day now, I will be the person at the San Diego Con who has the oldest credits in professional comics. And I still feel like I got into business a couple months ago.
Yeah.
And I no longer can do a golden age panel. There's no golden age artists. I can't do a silver age panel. There's no silver age artists. I can't even do a 60s panel. And we've had trouble putting together a 70s panel a couple times. So anyway, so through all that time, I never made comic books my whole income. I was never wholly dependent on them. I always wrote other things. That came from watching Jack and his wishes that he could do something besides comics. He could get into other fields. Another thing I learned from Jack was to work hard. No matter what the project is, even if you think it's going to be ruined, even if you think it's going to go to a bad inker or a bad colorist or the editor is going to chop the hell out of it, give 110%. Jack's work ethic was amazing. And one day I looked at Jack and I said, you know, Mark, you're never going to have the genius of this man because nobody does. He was a brilliant man. So many ideas came out of him. You can't believe how many ideas he would just throw out of no place, just come out of no. I watched him create the Demon in about 12 minutes. I mean, he just could come up with these things out of nowhere. So I looked at him and I said, you're never going to have that genius, but it might be possible to work that hard.
Yeah.
You could work that hard. And it's a lesson I learned, and it's served me well to try to just, yes, you'd rather go watch a movie. Yes, you'd rather go on a vacation. Yes, I work all the time, and I love it. If you love the work, it's not work anymore. So I learned that from Jack. The other thing was, he used a phrase a lot, look at the big picture. You start talking about anything, and Jack would say, you better look at the big picture. Look at how this fits into the whole world. Looks at, if you talk about, oh, Marvel's doing this. Yeah, but look at the whole company. Look at the whole direction of things. And an awful lot of the genius stuff that's in Jack Kirby comics is him looking at the big picture. He's talking about isolated incidents, but they're all part of a bigger picture, which is why the New Gods worked as well as it did, because it was part of a bigger picture that Jack was inventing as he went along and exploring. And he never plumbed all of it, but he had enough insight into where everything was going to make it a very rich comic. And I read those comics over about every 2 or 3 years.
Mm-hmm.
And I look at them and I go, why didn't I notice that before?
Yep.
It's like sitting on my shelf here. Opposite me here, there's a shelf all full of Jack Kirby stuff. And I look at the shelf, it's got all the different hardcover New Gods collections. There've been about a dozen of them. Mm. And I have my copy. I don't have my copies there because I wrote forwards for most of them. I have my copies there because I like to look at them and remember the people at DC saying, this book will never sell. Mm. And it will never sell as well as The Unexpected or Ghosts. Well, there's no hardcover Unexpected or Ghosts volumes out. Or if there are
tales or
I mean, DC has now reprinted those books so often, and every time they put them out, they charge more for them and they sell more copies. Mm-hmm. And they are just and they're rich. And I look at them and I go, boy, I never noticed this before. I never noticed this before. They're so rich with material in them. And I also find Jack in places I hadn't seen him before in those stories. So I don't want to read them every week because I'm afraid that will run out at some point. They'll get stale for me if they get too. But I will sit down and read those comics over every couple of years, and I just think they're just wonderful, wonderful books. And I wrote about an 1/18 of 1% of them. I mean, it's Jack Kirby's work. I gave him some ideas. I wrote 1 page of a Mr. Miracle. I deserve absolutely zero credit for anything in there. And people who mock Jack's writing would say, Oh yeah, well, Evanier rewrote some of that. No, that's absolutely a lie, and it's one of the reasons I didn't put the word writing credit on Groo.
Yeah.
Because Sergio was doing writing, and I thought the minute the word writer gets attached to my name, people are never going to understand that Sergio's a writer as well.
How's your Jack book coming?
It's coming along. I finally have at the moment no legal encumbrances to finishing it, which for a long time it was like, please don't finish this book, don't put it out yet, don't write this yet. And I'm going to try to get it done. So, have you been to the Kirby exhibit at the Skirball Center?
I have not yet. It's good.
Get yourself over there. Get over there. It is a wonderful, wonderful exhibit. It is just, I got out of the hospital. I was in the hospital for a procedure, and a lady friend of mine said, "You're going to that?" I said, "Well, I probably should stay home and rest." No, you're going. And she came over and she cut my hair and she got me dressed up. She picked out the clothes. John Morrow, who does the Kirby Collector, was in town for that. He picked us up. He drove us to the Skirball Center, and I just had one of the best evenings of my life, just seeing Jack being celebrated the way he deserved to be celebrated. And I was so happy, and I got to see all these Jack Kirby fans there and Jack Kirby relatives and people who love Jack Kirby comics are some of the best people in the world. I have such fun doing the Kirby panels at San Diego every year. We do them on Sunday morning at 10, and it might be my favorite part of the convention because I'm in a room full of people who love Jack Kirby, and those are the best people in the world because they get it. Seeing all these Jack Kirby fans, and the work is so beautifully displayed. And there's lovingly, and there's captions, and there's this mannequin wearing Jack's old army uniform that passes for it, and there's all this great Kirby art there, and Mike Royer was there, standing there, in front of pages he'd inked, and people were going up to Mike and giving him. Mike Royer never got enough credit for the hard work he did, the faithfulness he did, the fact that he never left out anything to be lazy. And he managed to somehow not only ink all those pages, which a lot of great inkers could not have done just in terms of volume. He also lettered them too, and the lettering is beautiful on most of those pages. And Mike was there. I got to see Mike again, and it was just a wonderful, wonderful evening. And it's going to be there through March. And get there. Please go get it if you can. It is to people who don't live in Los Angeles, it is probably worth planning a vacation to that. And if you love the Marx Brothers, go to see the Marx Brothers exhibit at the Hollywood Museum in Hollywood. Same time, have a double header that day. Kirby and Groucho. So it's just a wonderful thing that Jack is getting the recognition he's getting. He doesn't yet have all he deserves, but he's getting more and more, and people realize that he did not just draw up somebody else's ideas.
Yeah.
Those were his ideas for the most part. He was driving those stories. Stanley even admitted to me in private a lot. Jack had these ideas, and ideas just poured out of this man. If you went to Jack with an idea for a new comic, and a lot of people did, he would say, "That's great. And how about if he did this, this, and this?" And he'd tell you all these ideas you could spin off of your idea, and you think, "Wait a minute. Did I tell him this idea 6 months ago? And he's been thinking about that all the time." No, they just came to him. Ideas just popped out of. He says some of them were just golden. He was so good at coming up with things. He was such a nice man. He and Roz, and I feel very valued. And that's one of the reasons I do Kirby panels and I write this book and things like that. I feel so privileged that I got to know this man and to be with him as much as I was. And I feel I need to share that.
Everyone, we want to thank Mark Evanier. Buy his new book, The Essential Peanuts, the greatest comic strip of all time, at your local Costco or Amazon or wherever you get fine literature. It is well worth it. Mark, we could keep you for another 4 hours. Oh, you got to come back sometime. Please promise us.
I will come back sometime if you'll go see the Jack Kirby exhibit at the
Done. And Richard, you have to be proud of me. I did not bring up Vinnie Coletta once.
Not once.
So dodge that bullet. Thank you again, Mark.
Thank you, Mark.
Anytime, guys. Thank you.
Woo! Huh?
That was awesome.
I didn't even scratch the surface. That's the sad part.
The stories of the people he's interacted with over the years is just insane.
Hey, thank you all for watching. And if you're new here, why not hit like and subscribe, follow us along, go look through the archives and see more great bronze, silver, Copper Age podcast action. Yeah. Members, we'll see you Thursday. Everyone else, we'll see you next Monday.
Everybody, stay safe.